It's a great pleasure to be introduced by a head girl. When I was at Godolphin, I was definitely not head girl material, but there was a lovely head girl called Abby, and I thought she was the most extraordinarily impressive human being I'd ever met. So thank you very much. And also lovely to be surrounded by pinnies. That's incredibly heartening. I need to go home and get mine out, I think. So when I was at Godolphin, I spent most of my time drawing and painting. I was one of those girls constantly covered in paint. I'm not sure really how I got any A-levels, but I did manage it somehow. Sadly, I rarely have time to draw and paint nowadays, although to be honest, I think my work was fairly mediocre. Yeah, so at the time, I painted this when I was 16, and at the time I thought it was really good. But now I just think it looks a bit like a rip-off of a 1980s United Colours of Benetton advert. The girls will have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's fine. However, I absolutely loved art. I also, my second love, was history. Absolutely fantastic. And of course, I had Miss Miller, so lucky. And it's so nice to see her and Mr. Egg tonight. I think they might be the only teachers left from my time, so lovely, lovely to see them. I also rather enjoyed the study of antique architecture and classical civilization with Miss Codd, who's now retired, but taught at Godolphin for about 700 years. I loved antique architecture so much that my poor parents got pressured into taking me to Greece for a tour of Mycenaean fortifications during the spring half-term of my lower sixth. You can tell I was always really cool. I also rather enjoyed English, or at least Mr. Lycett and Mrs. Carlyle were very, very patient with me. But my great enemy was science. I struggled with science, although rather amusingly, I'm now married to a rather brilliant research chemist, so karma is real, and I never really understand what my husband is talking about. Anyway, my loves of art, architecture and history made my path at university rather clear. So I went off to York, as you've heard, and I stayed there for a rather absurd 9 years of tertiary education. I think I might have developed a bit of a Peter Pan complex. But I emerged, as you've heard, with various qualifications and became a specialist in early modern British architectural drawings. Quite niche, I realise. Anyway, this image that you're looking at here is one of my favourites among the drawings that I care for. It's a 1770s design for an ornamental ceiling in a drawing room in a house called Northumberland House, which was on Trafalgar Square until it was demolished in the 1850s. I think this drawing is utterly extraordinary. The vibrancy of the colours, all in natural pigments, of course, is amazing, considering the fact that it survived for 250 years. I love this image so much, I actually used it as the cover image of my last book. Actually, I'm lying, I realise. Not all of the pigments on this drawing are natural for the geeks like me among you. The blue, the lapis lazuli blue, is the first modern synthetic pigment. No one cares? No, okay. It's called Prussian Blue. It was invented by accident in 1708-9 in Germany, using what was it, potatoes and something else. You see, I'm no good at science. But all the other pigments on this drawing are natural, so that beautiful coppery green is verdigris, the pink is rose madder, the yellow, rather disgustingly, is turmeric that's passed through the digestive system of a cow, things like that. But Prussian blue, very beautiful. Anyway, so in 2010, while I was still doing my PhD, I was approached by a man called Tim Knox, then fairly little known, but now terribly important because he's the director of the Royal Collection. But back in 2010, Tim Knox was the director of Sir John Soane's Museum in London, and he had a job he wanted me to apply for. He'd heard me give an extremely dull talk at an academic conference the year before, and apologies if this is a sort of bit of a rerun of that. But anyway, it is dull, so bear with me. But that talk was about an 18th century architect called James Paine, who was from Andover, who had changed and moulded Italian-style architectural designs so as to be more appropriate for the cold and wet climatic conditions of the British Isles. The result was some truly ugly houses like this. This is Ormsby Hall near Middlesbrough. But unfortunately, A friend of mine had paid me £30 the morning before I gave this rather dull talk, on the understanding that throughout my presentation, instead of using the word climatic, I would instead use the word climactic. A little bit immature and borderline rude, I realise. So it turned out that my first proper boss, now someone really rather important, had encountered me on a day when I had been totally unprofessional, an absolute wally, for financial gain, no less. 30 quid, I mean, it's pathetic. Anyway, happily, it didn't actually matter, because I now know that the great and important Tim Knox himself rather enjoys slipping unexpected words into his own talks, considering it a fun challenge to try and make it feel natural and unlaboured. For example, he rather enjoys the word trepanning. Here you are. I find this poster rather amusing. I love the idea of a freak haircut when you go for your trepanning. Anyway, so Tim happily most likely found my repeated use of climactic rather amusing rather than offensive, thank goodness. So I went for a job interview at the Soane Museum and was duly put in charge of a project, as you've heard, to attribute and catalogue the 9,000 drawings from the office of the Scottish architects Robert and James Adam. Now, if you haven't heard of Robert Adam, then I'm sure you've heard of the style that he innovated in this country. It's called neoclassicism. And his work survives in a vast number of country houses, many of them open to the public, many of them belonging to the National Trust. Here are some examples, both in photographs and their original architectural drawings. The library at Kenwood at the top, and the hall at Soane at the bottom. And if nothing else, you will certainly have seen these rooms used as film sets, whether you realise it or not. But I'm sure you sort of understand, basically, the decorative format that you're looking at. Almost 3 years ago, I was promoted, and I'm now one of 3 senior curators at the Soane Museum. But I must admit, I still prefer the Adam drawings to anything else that I look after, because they're just gorgeous. What do I actually do, and does it matter to the world and society? I'm rather biased, but of course I think it actually does. The arts encompass almost every element of our modern lives. The buildings we live in, the clothes we wear, the books we read, the music we listen to, the medicines we take, and the technology we use. Cars and computers are as much the result of creative design as your favourite painting. All of these forms of human activity would be non-existent were it not for our capacity for creativity. Being as old as mankind, the arts have been our means of communication, celebration, and recording our activities since the dawn of our time. Moreover, they're the first form of communication that humans ever encounter. A small child is most likely to scrawl a fridge-worthy masterpiece in crayon, displaying newfound motor skills and their burgeoning creativity and self-expression, long before they're able to speak fluently, or indeed, of course, write. So, from Paleolithic cave paintings through Egyptian pyramids, the Great Wall of China, the frescoes at Pompeii, the Bayeux Tapestry, the Mona Lisa, Monet's water lilies, and even the Sydney Opera House, art and the arts are intertwined with our existence, evolving with our state of sophistication, and comprising the favoured medium with which to express what cannot always be expressed by other means. Furthermore, art and the arts more widely are entirely timeless. Human lives are relatively short, but books and plays, poetry, fine art, architecture, music, and of course, most obviously, cave paintings can remain unfaded for millennia. It's perhaps marginally tangential, but I also want to mention alongside the breadth and longevity of the arts, the necessary freedom of expression, which so often, not exclusively, but often falls crucially within the realm of the arts. I can think of a few other modes of human interaction or production which have always allowed for such an incredible freedom. Just think of the famous 1877 Whistler-Ruskin lawsuit. The art theorist and critic John Ruskin absolutely hated the now much admired work of James Whistler, the famous American painter. He wrote of this painting, which is called Nocturne in Black and Gold, quote, "I never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face." Rather rude. In response to this, Whistler, now very famous, sued Ruskin for defamation, £1,000, an awful lot of money in those days. It resulted in the most famous lawsuit in art history. Whistler, of course, won the lawsuit. He was free to express his artistic skills in whatever manner he wished, but it seems that the judge could rather see Ruskin's point of view about the painting, and instead of awarding Whistler £1,000, he was given only a farthing, quarter of a penny. So both men felt that they had won, albeit both men were left near to bankruptcy because they'd spent all their money on legal fees. So it's all a bit of a sort of nonsense, really. And of course, Whistler is now remembered as one of the best and most celebrated of all American artists. So one has to think, really, whether Ruskin had a leg to stand on, or whether in his own contemporary context, he was actually making a good point. Forms of creativity which push the boundaries of their contemporary norms, like Whistler's work, often comprise those which form the opinions of later generations. The best example I could think of when I was putting this lecture together was the work of the Catholic German novelist Erich Remarque, particularly his book All Quiet on the Western Front. You've probably heard of it. It was published in 1928 and adapted into an Oscar-winning film in 1930. It deals with the horrible subject of war, and particularly the horrors of war, and the physical and mental stresses that were placed upon a small group of German soldiers during the First World War, and then their resulting difficulty integrating back into civilian life. So it's not a pleasant subject. The book and the film's message decry the horrors of violence and war, and that message resonated around the world, particularly when the film was made. So much so that a rather unpleasant man called Joseph Goebbels, who was then district leader of Berlin, orchestrated mobs to attack screenings of the film, offering us an early display of his thuggery even before the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. Attacks on the films resulted in it being banned, made illegal, across Germany and Austria, and hard copies of the book were burnt. Goebbels himself dubbed these attacks as a, quote, cleansing of the German spirit, and poor old Remarque's German citizenship was revoked and he moved to Switzerland. Perhaps it's fanciful to imagine, but what impact might Remarque's work have had on the German national psyche and the unfolding of history in the 1930s and 40s had his artwork, All Quiet on the Western Front, been more widely absorbed? I suppose we'll never know. As with Remarque's work, when thinking about the importance of the arts, as well as our heritage and culture, we start quite naturally with the social and educational benefits that they can bestow. But one must also consider the economic factors. However, I would suggest that the financial matters, which I'll come to in a minute, must be seen as a secondary issue, as otherwise we inevitably fall into Oscar Wilde's celebrated definition of the cynic, which of course famously is knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. I believe that most people understand this quite instinctively. There are, of course, plenty of things in life onto which we can't put a price tag. So put money to one side for just a moment and imagine our society without the civilizing influences of the arts, and you must strip away most of what's pleasurable in life and also much of what's educationally vital. Take the collective memory from our museums, remove the orchestras and choirs from our concert halls and schools, drop plays and dance from our theatres, expel books from our libraries, cancel our festivals, burn our literature and fine art, and what's left? A society bereft of national conversation about its memory, identity, or really a great deal else that excites most people's enthusiasm. Our national arts and heritage are certainly not a frontline service like the NHS. No one can pretend that they are. But we are widely coming to understand their effectiveness in a complementary role. What's life without a little enjoyment? Look at the work of the orchestras such as the Royal Philharmonic, which run workshops for people with dementia and mental health issues. All of the national museums hold programs for vulnerable adults and children, including the elderly and the homeless, as well as undertaking outreach programs for those with access requirements. Art therapy is one of the most effective complementary therapies treatments for mental health. And how about the popularity of the books on prescription scheme in the GP's surgeries? So the arts are for everybody, irrespective of who they are and what their personal requirements might be. There is indeed a strong relationship between the arts and cultural engagement and educational attainment. We see improvements in literacy and confidence when young people take part in drama, as well as better performances in maths and languages when they take part in structured musical activities. There's a very good reason why the Department for Education includes arts and humanities subjects alongside maths, science, and languages among encouraged GCSE subjects. After all, not everybody wants to turn into my husband and become a research chemist. Certainly not. So, my own professional involvement with the arts is fairly clear-cut. As you've heard, I'm the curator of drawings and books at Sir John Soane's Museum, which is our smallest and most eccentric national museum. In my role, I care for 30,000 drawings ranging from the 15th century to the 19th century, as well as 7,000 books ranging from the 12th century to the 19th century. I also manage a research library and its staff. I direct cataloguing projects as well as training and supervising staff for those projects. I write most of our in-house exhibitions, which deal with material from our own collection. I oversee loans of books and drawings to exhibitions in external institutions. I give tours and lectures. I write for publications of numerous sorts. I schmooze donors and corporate events hosts. That's very, very important. And rather terrifyingly, I sit on an emergency team which would swing into action in the event of fire, flood, war, God forbid, or a terrorist event. I must admit that it's not entirely normal for a senior curator in a national museum to undertake such a variety of responsibilities, but bear in mind that I work in a relatively small institution. We only have 76 staff, only 32 of them are full-time, and the majority of those staff work in commercial, fundraising, or front-of-house roles. Curatorial and conservation are very, very much the minority. This means that in my profession as a curator, the accumulation of collection-specific expertise and institutional memory are absolutely key. If permanent jobs are forthcoming, curators tend to remain in post for a considerable number of years in order to achieve this. However, funding doesn't always allow for permanent positions. For example, my first 5.5 years at the Soane Museum comprised a series of relatively short-term contracts. As I said, the Soane is the smallest of the national museums, and a national museum is one which falls within public ownership on account of the fact that the collection is considered to be of national or even international importance. The British Museum, as you probably know, was the first national museum in the world, and it epitomizes the very concept of a national museum. It came into being in 1753 on the death of an Irish physician and naturalist called Sir Soane, who you can see here. He had collected more than 71,000 artifacts of natural and historical interest, which he then bequeathed to the British nation, thereby founding the collection of the British Museum, which of course has much grown since that time. Soane was quite clear about the purpose of his collection, stating that it was, quote, for the glory of God and the benefit of mankind. And if you don't particularly like that, then perhaps this is better. Later, in 1753, the British Museum Act was passed, declaring that the collection was to be, quote, preserved and maintained, not only for the inspection and entertainment of the learned and curious, but for the general use and benefit of the public. Noble aims indeed. Collectively, our national museums receive over 70 million visitors each year. There are over 2,000 museums in Britain, but only 14 of these are national museums. I'm clearly counting all the Tates, or the Imperial War Museum Group or the Science Museum Group as single organisations. So there are 14 of these organisations. Arts and heritage organisations such as the National Museums or the National Trust, for example, are the major leaders in British tourism, an industry which currently, according to the Office for National Statistics, contributes around 10% of our GDP. Tourists do not visit London for the weather, obviously. They visit, yes, to go shopping or to eat in fabulous restaurants, but for the most part they visit for the historic buildings, the museums and the galleries. According to Visit Britain, 8 of the top 10 popular attractions in the UK are national museums. Not terribly surprising, but perhaps more impressive is the fact that 3 of the top 10 world attractions are national museums in Britain. They are the British Museum, the National Gallery, and the Natural History Museum, and I'm quite sure that every single person in this room has most likely visited all of them at least once. Over half of British adults visit a national museum at least once a year, and to put that into context, that's more than the number of people who watch football on television. And just over 65% of our foreign visitors to the UK cite our arts and heritage as the principal reason for their visit, although, of course, we do have good reason to disbelieve a couple of Russians who visited Salisbury earlier this year. Similar trends can be seen across the EU, and this is why other EU countries have, on average, increased their arts and heritage public funding by 27% in the last year, ostensibly treating their funding as an investment in their tourism industries. Sadly, the situation in the UK is far less certain, for obvious reasons, and the previous spending cuts, I'm afraid, are more likely to be increased than reversed. The cuts had a big impact on the British National Museums, many of which had, of course, to reduce staff numbers quite drastically, and with that their educational and conservation programmes. And it was particularly bad for the physically small institutions who couldn't just open endless shops and cafes. Very sadly, worst of all, was the case of numerous local authority museums that had to close altogether. And it is actually just worth noting, I'm sorry it's a bit soapboxy of me, but our European neighbours did not cut the funding to their museums during the austerity measures because they recognised the museum's vital importance to their tourism industries. So yes, the national museums are a great money spinner for the country, but you may feel inclined to ask why they are funded by the government at all. Well, in 2001, all of the national museums in this country made an agreement with the government to provide free entry for everybody. The idea was to boost UK economy through tourism, which it did. And in return, the public purse would cover a large portion of their annual running costs. The National Museum's Directors' Council, so the most important group of people working in museums in this country, has recently commissioned research to think about the impact of stepping away from the 2001 agreement and refusing public funding altogether, so as to be no longer beholden to the vagaries of changing government regimes, and instead charge visitors for entry again. However, with the inevitable reduction in visitor numbers that this would entail, plus the sudden implication of paying VAT, it would be necessary to charge an unrealistic sum per visitor. I have a number, but I'm not going to give it to you unless you really want it. Meaning that educational and outreach programmes would inevitably cease, the cultural life of Britain would be confined to the elite of the socio-economic spectrum, and tourism would decline steeply, having an impact on our economy. I must admit that I don't mean to suggest that our other publicly funded services are not absolutely paramount to our lives, but I think it important to note that unlike our other public services, culture, arts and heritage in particular, receive a tiny fraction of public funding while resulting in a major economic benefit for the country. Personally, I would argue that the cultural enrichment, educational and mental health benefits of our national museums are even more significant to the well-being of society than the economic benefits of their existence. Of course, we're all different. You're very welcome to disagree with me on that point. But I would just return to the issue about a society without the arts, having no national memory, limited national conversation, limited national identity, and therefore surely being doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. Now, this is all sounding a bit grim, so I'm going to lighten up now, and I apologise for being so grim, because the picture truly isn't all bad. One of the positives from the uncertainty in funding is the increase in employment opportunities for those interested in arts development, fundraising, and commercial activities. If you, for example, are interested in managing events in museums and galleries and historic venues, then you're most likely in luck. That is going on every day of the year. Moreover, the commercial arts sector, a slightly different but related arena, is booming. I went to the preview of the Frieze Masters show on Wednesday, and the place was absolutely awash with money. Not necessarily the nicest people in the world, but they were very, very wealthy, so there's plenty of money if you're interested in the contemporary arts market. Moreover, with the prevalence of apprenticeships and increased funding for training schemes from organisations like the London Livery Companies, the National Museums are increasingly able to support early careers. I currently have 3 trainees working for me, 2 of whom are funded by the livery companies. 2 of them have just started working for me following their PhDs, and one extremely impressive young lady has just started working for me following her MA. And I've never had a trainee that's then failed to find a good second job in the arts and heritage sector, so it is definitely possible. Permanent curatorial positions in museums may be fairly few and far between, but there are over 500,000 people working in the heritage sector alone. So there are definite opportunities. Personally, I absolutely love the cultural capital attached to the profession of working in the arts. Excuse me. When I tell people what I do for a living, they tend to be rather pleased and want to know more, and I don't necessarily think that my husband gets the same response, which is rather pleasing. My favourite example of this is from about 2 years ago. I was at yet another rather dull academic conference, this time up in Edinburgh, and I met a charming, rather eccentric elderly architect who, when I told him what I did, rather shakily lowered himself to one knee, and he said, "Ah, the priestess of the temple." And I have to say, it made my day. As a curator, one of the most effective means I have for public enrichment is obviously through the exhibitions that I compose and write. My most recent, which is in my home institution, the Soane Museum, it's actually still open for a few more days, deals with a series of rather exquisite early 19th century architectural drawings which were made in the office of Sir John Soane, the founder of my museum, as a means of educating student architects. From 1806 until his death in 1837, John Soane held the prestigious position of Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy in London. And you can see him here sketched rather charmingly by one of his students as he's delivering a lecture, looking rather more elegant than me. Other than through an apprenticeship in an architectural practice, the Royal Academy provided quite literally the only place to study architecture at this point. So Soane was the country's only teacher, Georgian Britain's Mr. Egg, if you like. So, it was Soane's job to write a series of lectures which would explain the history of architecture, giving examples of good and bad buildings, as well as how to go about the different activities involved in the architectural profession. Soane took his teaching extremely seriously. It had always been something he'd enjoyed. He'd always had apprentices in his office, and he made himself rather unpopular with his contemporaries by being rather outspoken about actually educating one's apprentices rather than just treating them as unpaid labour. So he was quite forward-thinking for the 18th century. And at the Royal Academy, he had the chance to influence every brilliant architect of the next generation, something that he just couldn't resist. He felt that in order for an aspiring architect to fulfill the demands of their future career, it was absolutely necessary for them to undertake a program which would help them understand the history of the subject first. After all, how are they supposed to design, for example, an elegant Gothic revival building if they had no comprehension of where the Gothic came from, or indeed what had been tried before, what worked, what didn't? Thanks to a scholarship from King George III, Soane himself had travelled extensively around Europe as a young man taught himself languages, and observed a vast array of different types of art and architecture. He too had undertaken an apprenticeship, as well as attending the Royal Academy as a student of architecture, of course. But he knew that his experiences while travelling, particularly what he'd seen in France, Italy, Germany, and Switzerland, had been the most enormously beneficial experiences of his young life and for his professional development. However, during the first half of his own teaching career, Britain was in the throes of the Napoleonic Wars. The wars, of course, lasted 1803 to 15, and it wouldn't have been safe for anyone to travel while the war was going on. Soane was terribly worried on account of this, that there would be an entire generation of architects, excuse me, who lacked the experience and education of an aspiring architect to truly know what they were doing. So Soane undertook two projects which he thought would help them. First, he opened his home as a museum, allowing his ever-growing collection to function as a sort of grand tour in microcosm, and thereby enabling his students, and shortly thereafter the public, to peruse art, antiquities, and architectural forms that they might have seen had they actually been able to travel. Secondly, Soane commissioned his own architectural office to produce just shy of 1,000 large-scale, coloured, illustrative lecture drawings. Nowadays, of course, we use PowerPoint, and until relatively recently, people were using slides. But in 1806, the concept of illustrating a lecture was relatively unheard of, so Soane was being incredibly innovative. His 1,000 surviving lecture drawings are widely thought to comprise the earliest known drawn history of world architecture, a sort of paper museum, if you like. So these drawings not only allowed his students at the Royal Academy to glimpse the wider world from afar, but they also provided employment for his draftsmen and apprentices during the lean years of the Napoleonic Wars, when, of course, otherwise they would have had nothing to do and probably would have been made redundant. So the process of making these drawings wasn't just pedagogical, but also incredibly philanthropic. You can probably tell I'm a bit of a fan of Sir John Soane and his like. So people like Augustus Pitt Rivers, Viscount Fitzwilliam, Margaret Desson-Farnes, the founder of the Dulwich Picture Gallery, John Bowes, and of course Hans Sloane, I've already talked about. They're all, to my mind, great national heroes. And I wholeheartedly agree with many of them, particularly with Soane, that the history of the world and our role within it is written within the arts, and from my perspective, particularly the architecture that mankind has produced. So, with the last 15 minutes or so that I have left to me, I'm going to give you my own version of world history, admittedly from a very British perspective, through 10 architectural drawings, 10 of Soane's Royal Academy lecture drawings, appropriately enough. But please note, this is not to be taken seriously. So, number one. Around 12,000 to 8,000 BC, this image is called the primitive hut. So during the period of 12,000 to 8,000 BC, mankind started to abandon their nomadic hunter-gatherer existence and instead to settle as farmers. And they therefore needed houses to live in and barns to store their crops, things like that. So architecture was born. Although, to be fair, this drawing is a rather sort of classicized and romanticized version of what we think early architecture would have looked like. Certainly, I mean, it looks like a temple, doesn't it? Obviously, early architecture would not have looked like that. But still, nice idea. Moving on, I'm sure you know what this is. Around 3000 BC, Stonehenge, of course. Rather charmingly, Soane sent a whole group of his apprentices out to Stonehenge for a day trip so they could make this drawing, which I just think is charming. Anyway, Stonehenge, and lots of other things, to be perfectly honest, provide ample evidence of an organised society with established national and even international trade routes, and a very clear focus on basic scientific principles such as time and astronomy, as well as evidence of religion. Just a little bit later, around 2500 BC, more of very much the same, but this time in Egypt. The pyramids on the Giza Plateau are built. This drawing shows the three most famous of those pyramids, the three large ones. This is, of course, a rather unfortunate and forcible reminder of the existence of slavery, certainly, but it also shows us an interest, almost competitive interest, in the production of art forms, as well as early monetary wealth and a hierarchical social structure with dynastic legacies where power and property passed within families from one generation to the next. So around 600 BC, Miss Miller might disagree, to 333 AD, the Romans. This is a drawing showing part of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which is in the Forum in Rome, of course being rather charmingly inspected by a Georgian tourist, I suspect a brave student architect, a rickety ladder measuring the different elements of the architecture. So emulating earlier civilizations like the Greeks, we all know that the Romans built their fabulous temples, basilicas, baths and palaces, etc. They also, of course, conquered Europe, North Africa, the Near East, and, of course, Britain, very important. And they brought to their empire all sorts of things which we take for granted. Bricks, concrete, paved roads, plumbing, sanitation, early medicine, education, public order. I sound like Monty Python, I'm going to stop. 520 AD, possibly a little bit less familiar to you. This is the temple of the Emperor Theodoric, which was built in Ravenna in Italy. It's one of the preeminent examples of the power, wealth, and civilizing influence of the Byzantine Empire during the so-called Dark Ages. The Byzantine Empire, if you don't know, is the successor to the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine, in the year 333 AD, moved the Roman capital from Rome to what we now think of as Istanbul, a place that he called Constantinople, but which in this period was called Byzantium. So this is essentially a Dark Ages version of the Roman Empire, and they created incredibly beautiful buildings. 1066 to 1500 and onwards, we get the cathedrals. You see, this is a very British-orientated world history. This, as you may recognize, is Westminster Abbey, built in the 13th century. Christianity had been legalized, again by Constantine, in 330 AD. Its influence, of course, had spread quickly. And following the Norman conquest of Britain in 1066, the European and particularly French ability to build magnificent ecclesiastical structures was brought to Britain. This not only revolutionized the religious and liturgical processes of the country, excuse me, but also brought an increase to monastic houses and therefore also in alms and healthcare for the poor, literacy to a wider selection of people, and the wealth and influence of the Catholic Church. Although, of course, as we know, this was somewhat reversed by Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in 1536 to 41. 1400 to around 1600, we have the Renaissance. I'm sure you all know what that is. Starting in Italy, this was the rebirth of classical ideals such as humanism, art, and architecture, and is often seen as the start of modern-day democracy. This is a rather beautiful and structurally astonishing cantilevered stone staircase designed by the influential 16th century Venetian architect Andrea Palladio. If you don't know who he is, read up on him, he's great. Next, number 8, I give you the 18th century, the so-called Age of Enlightenment and the rise of the middle classes. The Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical, as well as scientific and artistic movement that dominated Europe throughout the 18th century and sort of undermined the power that previously had been held by monarchy and the church. The idea was to promote personal liberty, liberalism, political reform, religious tolerance, commercial enterprise, and extremely elegant buildings. And it's why, during the 18th century, we start seeing public institutions like national museums, and why we start seeing a huge growth in literacy and commercial activities. You start seeing trade and middle-class people becoming quite wealthy. This is a great example of beautiful 18th century architecture. This is Cartwright Gardens in London that was built by James Burton. I'm nearly done, don't worry. So, number 9, the late 18th and 19th centuries and the Industrial Revolution. And at a very exciting time in British history. At this time we see the rise of steam power along with other scientific advancements. This period saw the beginning of the manufacturing process and the factory system, bringing vast wealth to Britain. It really is the reason that we could afford to build things like the railway system. And it resulted in huge-scale urbanisation and an increase in average incomes, as well as population growth. This drawing shows a rather charming series of designs for oil and gas-powered streetlights from the early years of the 19th century. Imagine what it must have been like if your family had lived in the countryside, then decided to move to a city in order to find work, and then suddenly at night time it wasn't dark anymore. That just must have been an utterly extraordinary experience. Number 10, my final image, we have the 20th century. And with the 20th century, I'm afraid I'm completely ignoring, rather shamefully ignoring, things like the wars and female emancipation and the internet. And instead I give you the birth of modern healthcare. However, this drawing dates from around 1806, so it's a bit difficult for it to show modern healthcare. It's rather the antithesis of that. These are the gates of the Bethlehem Hospital, better known as Bedlam, the famous mental institution. And you can see on these gates we have Caius Gabriel Cibber's famous sculptures, Melancholy on the left, and, not politically correct, apologies, Raving Madness on the right. They were incredibly famous, and they were supposed to represent the patients, or the inmates inside Bedlam. Happily, we have moved on from such crude times, and indeed we must all move on. I'm actually driving home to Cambridge this evening, so I hope that I have not moaned too much about the plight of the National Museums. You can see Mrs. Loxton laughing at me. And I hope that I've interested you a little in the arts. So thank you very much for listening to me.